It was late afternoon on December 14, 2025, when a quiet in a Brentwood house became something else, a silence that would ripple around the world. The name Robert Reiner had for decades been spoken with affection by people who loved movies, who loved laughter, and who loved the rare filmmaker who could make you cry and laugh in the space of the same scene. Tonight, those sentences stopped. By evening, the world learned that Rob Reiner, the actor who had become a defining director of modern American cinema, would never make another film. He was 78. The place where he lived, loved, and told stories, his family's home, had become a focus of investigation and sorrow. Those who had watched his career from the beginning and those who discovered him more recently shared the same stunned, instinctive reaction: disbelief. And yet, beneath that first blunt grief, another thing began to stir, a single enigmatic line from something Reiner had said, recorded just weeks earlier, that has been replayed and parsed tens of thousands of times. The words were fragmentary, ordinary almost, a private cadence that now, disembodied and repeated, reads like an epitaph. Someone saved that line. Someone kept it. That final message, short, immediate, seemingly incidental, has made people reassess everything they thought they knew about the man who made The Princess Bride and When Harry Met Sally. This video unspools the life and career of Rob Reiner, and it follows the path of that last message, where it came from, who heard it, and the ways it changes the story we tell about family, fame, and the cost of being a public figure. Rob Reiner was born into a world where laughter was not accidental, it was engineered. Long before he ever called action on a film set, his life was shaped by timing, rhythm, and the invisible mechanics of comedy. His father, Carl Reiner, was already a legend in the making, a writer, performer, and creative force whose fingerprints were all over the golden age of American television. To grow up as Carl Reiner's son meant living inside a workshop where ideas were constantly being tested, sharpened, and discarded. But legacy is never simple. For Rob, it was both an inheritance and a weight. In the Reiner household, creativity was not romanticized, it was disciplined. Jokes were rewritten. Stories were argued over. Nothing survived unless it worked. From a young age, Rob learned that talent alone meant nothing without persistence. He also learned something quieter, that humor could be used to explore fear, insecurity, and truth without ever announcing those intentions out loud. His mother, Estelle Reiner, provided the emotional counterbalance. Where Carl brought intellectual rigor, Estelle brought observation. She noticed people. She listened. She understood how ordinary conversations could carry enormous emotional weight. Years later, her brief but unforgettable appearance in When Harry Met Sally would become iconic, but to Rob she was something more important, proof that authenticity outlasts spectacle. As a child, Rob was introspective. He was not driven by the need to dominate attention, nor was he content to fade into the background. He watched. He absorbed. He studied how people reacted to one another, how tone could change a room, how silence could say more than dialogue. Being surrounded by comedians did not make him loud, it made him precise. There was also the unspoken pressure of comparison. No matter what Rob accomplished, it would be measured against his father's achievements. Teachers, peers, and eventually industry professionals saw his last name before they saw his work. That awareness shaped him early. He did not want to imitate Carl Reiner. He wanted to translate what he had learned into something distinctly his own. By adolescence, Rob had developed a fascination with storytelling beyond jokes. He was drawn to films that explored friendship, loyalty, and moral tension. He asked questions that had no easy answers. Why do certain characters feel real long after the screen goes dark? Why do simple stories sometimes hurt more than complex ones? These questions would later define his career, but at the time, they were simply part of his internal dialogue. The roots of Rob Reiner's voice were already forming, quietly, patiently, long before anyone realized how far those roots would eventually reach. Rob Reiner's first brush with mass fame came not as a director, but as an actor, and not just any actor, but one embedded in one of the most culturally disruptive television shows of its time. When All in the Family premiered, it was unlike anything American audiences had seen. The show did not avoid conflict, it invited it. Politics, race, gender, and generational divides were no longer abstract concepts. They were dinner-table arguments, played out weekly in millions of homes. Rob's character, Michael Meathead Stivic, was designed to challenge Archie Bunker at every turn. Young, idealistic, stubborn, and outspoken, Meathead represented a new generation that refused to defer to tradition simply because it was old. It would have been easy to play the role as satire alone. Rob didn't. He played Michael as someone who genuinely believed he was right, and that sincerity made the clashes electric. Audiences reacted strongly. Some loved him. Others despised him. That polarization meant the performance was working. Night after night, Rob delivered lines that ignited debates far beyond the television screen. Yet fame came with a price. To many viewers, and to much of the industry, Rob Reiner was meathead. The role threatened to define him completely. Behind the scenes, however, Rob was learning. He paid attention to how scenes were constructed, how scripts evolved, how directors shaped performances without overpowering them. Acting taught him discipline and collaboration, but it also clarified his restlessness. He did not want to interpret stories forever. He wanted to build them. Leaving All in the Family was a risk. The show was a cultural juggernaut, and stepping away meant abandoning security for uncertainty. But Rob understood something fundamental: staying would be safer, but it would also be smaller. If he remained meathead, he might be remembered, but he would never be expanded. When he began shifting his focus toward directing, skepticism followed him. Television actors were not expected to become serious filmmakers. Many assumed he was aiming beyond his reach. Rob did not argue with those assumptions. He simply worked. This phase of his life marked a quiet but critical transformation. He was no longer content being part of the conversation. He wanted to shape it from the ground up. Rob Reiner's directorial breakthrough did not arrive cautiously. It arrived boldly. This Is Spinal Tap was, on paper, a gamble, a mock documentary about a fictional rock band, largely improvised, without traditional punchlines or narrative structure. In practice, it became something revolutionary. The film worked because Reiner committed fully to its reality. There was no winking at the audience, no reassurance that it was all a joke. That authenticity transformed satire into something deeper, an observation of ego, ambition, and absurdity. Hollywood noticed, slowly at first. But what followed was one of the most remarkable creative runs in modern cinema. With Stand By Me, Reiner revealed a new dimension of his voice. The film was tender without being sentimental, nostalgic without being dishonest. It treated childhood as a space of vulnerability, loyalty, and irreversible change. The story resonated because it respected its characters. Young boys navigating fear and friendship without adult protection. Reiner's direction allowed emotion to surface naturally, without manipulation. Then came The Princess Bride, a film that defied categorization. Comedy, romance, fantasy, it was all of these and none of them entirely. What made it endure was sincerity. Reiner understood that fantasy only works when it is emotionally grounded. The film became a cultural touchstone not because it tried to be iconic, but because it trusted its audience. When Harry Met Sally marked another evolution. The film explored love not as destiny, but as negotiation, timing, fear, and vulnerability colliding in everyday life. Its dialogue felt lived in. Its emotions felt earned. The film reshaped the romantic comedy genre by treating relationships as conversations rather than fairy tales. Finally, A Few Good Men demonstrated Reiner's command of tension and moral inquiry. The courtroom drama was not simply about guilt or innocence, but about power, responsibility, and truth. The film proved that Reiner could handle gravitas as confidently as humor. By the early 1990s, Rob Reiner was no longer being discussed as Carl Reiner's son, or as meathead. He was something else entirely. A filmmaker whose work spanned genres but shared a common philosophy: respect the audience, respect the characters, and never underestimate the power of a well-told story. What no one could have known then was how deeply personal those beliefs would later become, or how one final message would cast all of this work in a new haunting light. Behind Rob Reiner's public identity, the filmmaker, the activist, the cultural voice, existed a far quieter center: his family. It was there, away from cameras and premieres, that the contradictions of his life were most visible. Fame gave him reach, but family gave him gravity. Rob's marriage to Michelle Singer Reiner was not merely a personal partnership, it was a creative alliance built on mutual respect and shared values. Michelle was not content to live in the shadow of a famous last name. She forged her own path as a producer and advocate, often working on projects that reflected deeply held convictions about social justice, storytelling, and responsibility. Their collaboration blurred the line between home life and professional life. Conversations about dinner plans could just as easily turn into discussions about scripts, documentaries, or political causes. To those close to them, their relationship appeared grounded and purposeful. They were not performative about their marriage. There were no carefully staged public displays meant to reassure outsiders. Instead, what people noticed was consistency. Decades together in an industry that rarely sustains it. Rob often spoke of Michelle not as a muse, but as a compass. She challenged him. She questioned him. She reminded him when conviction threatened to harden into certainty. The Reiner household was also shaped by children growing up under the weight of a famous name. Being Rob Reiner's child meant living with privilege, access, and opportunity, but also scrutiny. The family worked hard to preserve a sense of normalcy, yet normalcy is fragile when the outside world feels entitled to your private life. The home itself became symbolic. It was a place associated with warmth, conversation, and continuity, a space where generations overlapped and history accumulated. Friends described it as lived in rather than curated, filled with books, memories, and reminders of work both completed and unfinished. It was not a monument to success, but a record of life in motion. Yet family dynamics are rarely simple. Love does not erase tension. Success does not eliminate vulnerability. As years passed, the family experienced moments of strain that were never fully visible to the public. These moments did not define them, but they shaped them, quietly, persistently. In retrospect, the family behind the fame was not a contradiction to Rob Reiner's public persona. It was its foundation. The stories he told on screen, about loyalty, conflict, forgiveness, and moral courage, echoed conversations he lived every day at home. Rob Reiner did not drift into politics. He charged into it. At a time when many celebrities carefully managed neutrality to protect careers, Reiner chose visibility over caution. He spoke openly, repeatedly, and often forcefully about his political beliefs. To him, silence was not sophistication, it was complicity. His activism became as much a part of his identity as his films, and for some audiences, it became impossible to separate the two. He used social media as a modern soapbox, posting commentary that was direct, emotional, and unapologetic. Admirers praised his courage and clarity. Critics accused him of arrogance and oversimplification. What no one could deny was his consistency. He was not performing outrage for relevance, he was expressing convictions he had held for decades. Politics reshaped his public relationships. Some collaborators distanced themselves. Others leaned closer. Invitations changed. Conversations shifted. Reiner was aware of the cost, but he accepted it willingly. In interviews, he often framed political engagement as an extension of storytelling, another way to shape narratives about justice, power, and accountability. His activism also blurred boundaries between public and private life. Political disagreements followed him into personal spaces, including online harassment and public backlash that went far beyond policy debate. The noise was constant. And while Reiner appeared unshaken, those close to him noticed the toll it took. What complicated matters further was that his political voice sometimes overshadowed his artistic legacy. Younger audiences discovered him first through commentary, not cinema. To some, he became a symbol rather than a person. That flattening troubled him more than criticism itself. Yet Reiner never retreated. He believed engagement mattered, especially later in life, when many public figures choose quiet comfort over confrontation. For him, the responsibility of influence did not diminish with age. It intensified. Politics did not replace his art. It reframed how the world interpreted it. The public saw Rob Reiner as confident, articulate, and unwavering. Interviews reinforced that image. He spoke with certainty. He laughed easily. He appeared settled in his identity. But private life rarely mirrors public presentation, and Reiner was no exception. Those closest to him understood that beneath the clarity lived complexity. Responsibility weighed heavily on him, not only as a filmmaker or activist, but as a father, husband, and cultural figure whose words carried consequence. He felt accountable not just for what he said, but for how it landed, how it echoed, and how it might be misused. In later interviews, subtle shifts emerged. He spoke more often about time, about urgency, about unfinished conversations. His tone occasionally softened, even darkened, when discussing legacy, not in terms of awards, but in terms of impact. What would last? What would be misunderstood? What would be reduced to headlines? Friends recall moments of introspection that felt out of character for the man known for certainty. He asked questions without clear answers. He worried, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, about the world his children inhabited, about polarization, about whether speaking out helped or hardened divides. These were not crises made public. They were quiet reckonings, unfolding in private conversations and reflective pauses. Reiner was not unraveling, he was taking inventory. The contrast between the assured public figure and the contemplative private man grew sharper as time passed. And it was within this space, between conviction and concern, that his final words would later be re-examined. What once sounded casual would become haunting. What once seemed complete would suddenly feel unfinished. In the final year of Rob Reiner's life, time seemed to move differently around him. To the outside world, he remained active, visible, and unmistakably engaged. He gave interviews. He commented on culture and politics. He appeared at events where his presence still carried weight, not as a relic of Hollywood's past, but as a voice that refused to recede quietly. Professionally, there was no announcement of retirement. No farewell tour. No public declaration that the end was near. If anything, Reiner appeared restless, still thinking forward. Conversations with colleagues suggested he remained interested in stories, not necessarily large films, but ideas. Reflections. Projects that carried meaning rather than spectacle. Yet something subtle had shifted. In interviews during this period, Reiner spoke less about success and more about consequence. Less about what he had achieved and more about what mattered. Listeners who revisited those recordings after his death noticed changes in cadence. Longer pauses, sentences that trailed off before being resolved. He was not rambling. He was choosing his words carefully. There was one phrase in particular, a line delivered almost casually, that would later become impossible to ignore. At the time, it sounded philosophical, even benign. A reflection about responsibility. About how stories outlive their tellers. About how truth has a way of resurfacing when people least expect it. The line passed unnoticed by most. It was not highlighted. It was not quoted in headlines. Only later would people return to it. Friends noticed that Rob Reiner had become more reflective in private conversations as well. He asked questions that were less rhetorical and more personal. What do people remember? What do they misunderstand? What do they assume they know? He was not fearful, but he was contemplative. Publicly, he remained sharp. Privately, he appeared to be taking inventory. The final year was not defined by retreat. It was defined by awareness. And awareness, as many would later realize, has a way of preparing a person for things they may never articulate directly. The night the world learned Rob Reiner was gone unfolded without drama, and that somehow made it worse. There were no flashing lights captured by cameras. No immediate press conference. Just a slow, irreversible shift from ordinary to unbearable. The kind of moment that divides time into before and after, even for those who were not present. Details emerged gradually, filtered through official statements and cautious reporting. What was clear was that something was wrong long before the public understood what had happened. A concern. A silence that lingered too long. A sequence of actions that now reads differently when viewed in retrospect. Neighbors would later describe an evening that appeared normal from the outside. No raised voices. No visible disturbance. Nothing that suggested history was about to be rewritten behind closed doors. When authorities arrived, the house that had once symbolized stability and creativity became a focal point of confusion and grief. Those who entered did so professionally, methodically, trained to observe without emotion. And yet, even in that discipline, the weight of the moment was undeniable. News traveled fast once it broke. Within hours, social media filled with disbelief. Tributes appeared before facts. Speculation followed before understanding. The modern rhythm of grief, instant, collective, and incomplete, took over. What people wanted most were answers. What they received instead were fragments. The night did not offer clarity. It offered rupture. In the days following Rob Reiner's death, attention shifted towards something small but persistent, a message. At first, it was referenced obliquely. A mention in conversation. A suggestion in reporting that there had been words left behind, not a formal statement, not a public address, but something recorded. Something saved. As details emerged, it became clear that this final message was not designed for the world. It was not polished. It was not symbolic by intention. That was precisely what made it powerful. The message existed in fragments. A recording. A line preserved unintentionally. A sentence that had once blended into the noise of everyday communication. It had been heard before, but only now did it demand attention. Those who encountered it described the same reaction. The words themselves were simple, but their context had changed completely. Meaning had shifted. Tone had deepened. What once felt reflective now felt deliberate. The message did not explain events. It did not confess or accuse. Instead, it posed a quiet challenge. One that forced listeners to reconsider assumptions they had made about certainty, about knowledge, and about how well we ever truly know the people closest to us. As the message circulated privately among investigators, family members, and eventually journalists, its power grew not because of what it revealed, but because of what it refused to resolve. It did not close the story. It opened it. When news of Rob Reiner's death became public, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Hollywood, an industry accustomed to loss, seemed to pause anyway. Tributes arrived in waves, from actors who had delivered their best performances under his direction, from writers who learned structure by studying his films, and from younger creators who had never met him but felt shaped by his work. Social media filled with fragments of memory, quotes from The Princess Bride, courtroom monologues from A Few Good Men, grainy behind-the-scenes photos from Stand By Me. For a moment, the industry spoke in unison, not in gossip, but in gratitude. Rob Reiner was remembered as a filmmaker who trusted audiences and protected actors, who believed tone mattered as much as dialogue. But as always, reverence shared space with speculation. The absence of immediate answers created a vacuum, and that vacuum filled quickly. Online conversations shifted from remembrance to rumor. Amateur timelines appeared. Anonymous accounts claimed insight. Headlines became more cautious even as comment sections became more reckless. The modern grief cycle accelerated, tribute, confusion, suspicion, all unfolding at once. Colleagues who had known Reiner well urged restraint. Several released statements emphasizing respect for the family and patience for facts. Others stayed silent, choosing not to contribute to the noise. The contrast was stark: public curiosity versus private devastation. What became clear was that Rob Reiner's death was no longer just a personal loss. It had become a public event, one shaped not only by who he was, but by the unanswered questions surrounding his final days. As grief spread, official statements began to emerge, measured, procedural, and intentionally limited. Authorities confirmed timelines without interpretation. They acknowledged an ongoing investigation without offering narrative. Each word was chosen carefully, aware that speculation could easily outrun fact. The house that had once symbolized continuity was now being discussed in terms of evidence and process. Investigators moved methodically, collecting information, reconstructing sequences, and separating confirmed detail from assumption. What they released publicly was sparse, but deliberate: dates, confirmations, and an insistence on patience. The family, through representatives, asked for privacy. Their statements were brief and restrained, focused on loss rather than explanation. Friends echoed the same message. This was not a story to be rushed, nor one to be told by outsiders filling gaps with imagination. Still, the pressure mounted. The public wanted clarity. The media wanted resolution. Each update, no matter how small, was amplified and dissected. In this environment, the final message gained new gravity. Investigators acknowledged its existence without characterizing it. They treated it as one element among many, neither sensationalized nor dismissed. That restraint only deepened public curiosity. The investigation at this stage was not about conclusions. It was about sequence. And sequence, as anyone who has followed such cases knows, often reshapes perception long before it delivers truth. Any story involving family inevitably invites simplification. Heroes and villains. Victims and causes. But real lives rarely cooperate with such neat categories, and nowhere was that more evident than in the public conversation surrounding Rob Reiner's son, Nick Reiner. Nick had grown up in proximity to both creativity and expectation. Like many children of prominent figures, his life unfolded under quiet scrutiny long before the world learned his name. He pursued creative work of his own, including filmmaking, navigating the complicated terrain of legacy, where opportunity and pressure coexist. Those familiar with his work often pointed to Being Charlie, a film that explored addiction, family tension, and self-destruction. In hindsight, commentators were quick to draw connections between art and life, sometimes responsibly, often recklessly. The danger of retrospective interpretation became apparent almost immediately. Friends of the family cautioned against reduction. Nick was not a symbol. He was not a metaphor. He was a person whose life, like many, contained contradiction, struggle, and attempts at meaning. Public records showed a man neither invisible nor infamous, simply human, navigating circumstances intensified by fame he did not choose. As attention focused on him, the narrative risked becoming distorted. Selective details were elevated while broader context was ignored. The same impulse that turns complex figures into headlines began pressing in from all sides. In the aftermath of Rob Reiner's death, the public appetite for explanation intensified. Timelines were rearranged. Past interviews were reinterpreted. Old films, old statements, even old silences were pulled into service as evidence of something larger, something hidden. The impulse was understandable. Tragedy feels intolerable without meaning. But meaning, when rushed, can become distortion. Online, theories multiplied with startling speed. Some framed the events as inevitable, others as shocking aberrations. Each theory promised clarity, yet most relied on fragments: a sentence taken out of context, a creative work treated as confession, a pause interpreted as intention. The more dramatic the theory, the faster it traveled. This is where the documentary draws a deliberate line. Speculation may feel like understanding, but it often replaces it. The danger lies not only in being wrong, but in being certain too soon. Certainty flattens complexity. It reduces people to roles and tragedies to templates. Rob Reiner's life, and the lives connected to his, resist that kind of compression. Responsible storytelling does not deny questions. It honors them without exploiting them. It distinguishes between what is known, what is suggested, and what is imagined. In this story, restraint is not avoidance. It is respect. The temptation to assign motive is powerful, especially when emotion runs high. But motive is rarely singular, and it is never simple. To pretend otherwise is to mistake narrative comfort for truth. The final message did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as resonance. Those who examined it closely, investigators, family members, and later experts, noted its ordinariness. There was no grand statement, no cinematic farewell. The words were brief, reflective, and open-ended. And yet, once the context changed, so did their weight. Psychiatrists cautioned against reading finality into isolated phrases. Human communication, they noted, is layered. Meaning shifts with circumstance. A sentence spoken casually can feel prophetic in hindsight, even if no prophecy was intended. This is not deception, it is the mind's attempt to organize loss. Filmmakers who had worked with Reiner heard echoes of his long-standing philosophy. He often spoke about responsibility, not just in art, but in life. About how stories shape people who never meet their authors. About how truth, once released, can no longer be controlled. To them, the message felt consistent rather than exceptional. Friends described it as familiar, thoughtful, unfinished in the way many of Rob Reiner's conversations were, not because he lacked clarity, but because he believed dialogue should continue beyond him. What makes the message powerful is not that it explains events. It doesn't. Its power lies in what it refuses to close. It invites reflection rather than resolution. It demands listening rather than decoding. In a culture obsessed with last words, this one resists finality. It does not end the story. It complicates it, and in doing so, honors the man who spent his life resisting easy conclusions. Rob Reiner's legacy does not live in a single achievement. It exists in fragments, scenes, lines, gestures, moments of recognition that continue to surface long after the credits roll. For some, his legacy is cinematic, a boyhood friendship walking along railroad tracks, a fairy tale romance that never talks down to its audience, a courtroom confrontation that still crackles with moral urgency. These films endure because they respect emotion without exploiting it. For others, his legacy is cultural. He proved that a filmmaker could move between genres without losing voice. That sincerity could coexist with humor. That entertainment did not have to be empty to be popular. Peers remember him as a director who listened, who trusted actors, who knew when to intervene and when to step back. Younger filmmakers cite him as evidence that longevity does not require reinvention, only integrity. And then there is the more complicated inheritance, the reminder that public figures are also private people. That influence magnifies consequence. That a life can be both admirable and unfinished at the same time. Legacy, in this sense, is not a monument. It is a conversation, one that continues to evolve as new generations encounter his work without the noise of headlines. Grief does not unfold according to schedule. In the days following Rob Reiner's death, rituals emerged, some formal, others spontaneous. Memorials were planned with care. Attendance was not about status, but about connection. Those who gathered did so quietly, aware that this was not a moment for performance. Stories were shared privately before they were shared publicly. Laughter surfaced unexpectedly, then gave way to silence. This oscillation, between memory and loss, defined the gatherings more than any speech could. Public ceremonies reflected the same restraint. Tributes focused on work, on collaboration, on gratitude. There was no attempt to resolve what remained unresolved. No effort to package grief into closure. Instead, there was acknowledgement of loss, of love, of complexity. For the family, ritual provided structure when understanding could not. For colleagues, it offered continuity. For audiences, it was a reminder that the stories they cherished were made by people. People who lived, struggled, and left behind both art and absence. Grief, like legacy, resists completion. It does not end. It transforms. And in that transformation, Rob Reiner's story continues, not as a single narrative, but as many overlapping ones, carried forward by those who remember, question, and refuse to simplify. As grief settled into something heavier, the story entered a new phase, one governed not by memory or emotion, but by process. Legal proceedings move slowly by design. They resist narrative momentum. They prioritize sequence over symbolism, evidence over implication. For a public accustomed to instant answers, this shift felt frustrating, even cold. Authorities confirmed only what procedure required them to confirm. Dates. Status. The existence of an ongoing legal process. Everything else was deliberately withheld. This restraint was not indifference, it was necessity. In cases involving high-profile individuals and profound loss, every word carries consequence. What became clear early on was that the legal system would not offer the kind of emotional resolution the public seemed to crave. There would be no dramatic declarations, no immediate clarity, no moment where confusion collapsed neatly into explanation. Instead, there would be filings, hearings, motions, a slow accumulation of record. Legal experts emphasized patience. Early stages, they explained, are not about judgment but preservation, of rights, of evidence, of due process. Conclusions, if they come, arrive only after time has done its work. For the family, this phase marked a painful transition. Mourning now existed alongside legal obligation. Private loss intersected with public procedure. Every step forward carried weight not just emotionally, but historically, each detail destined to become part of an official account. The future at this point was undefined. What came next would unfold not according to expectation, but according to law. And law, unlike storytelling, does not rush to meaning. Silence, when chosen, can be a form of protection. Following Rob Reiner's death, the family's public voice was restrained and intentional. Statements, when issued, were brief and focused on remembrance rather than explanation. There was no attempt to clarify what was still under review. No effort to shape interpretation. Only an insistence on dignity. Those close to the family described a deliberate choice to speak less, not more. In moments of public tragedy, words can quickly become tools for others, edited, reframed, or weaponized. The family understood that anything said too soon could not be taken back. When reflections were shared, they emphasized Rob Reiner not as a public figure, but as a husband, father, and friend. They spoke of humor in quiet moments. Of conversations that had nothing to do with films or politics. Of a man who listened carefully and cared deeply, even when he disagreed fiercely. Friends who spoke on the family's behalf echoed that tone. They asked for patience. For restraint. For recognition that grief does not perform well on demand. What the family did not do was equally important. They did not speculate. They did not respond to rumor. They did not attempt to control the broader narrative. Instead, they allowed space, trusting that time, rather than immediacy, would bring whatever clarity was possible. In an age of constant commentary, that choice stood out. As legal proceedings moved forward and public conversation continued, the film industry began its own process of reflection. Not the loud kind, no instant declarations or sweeping rewrites of legacy, but a slower reassessment shaped by distance and perspective. Studios revisited Rob Reiner's catalog. Retrospectives were planned. Film schools assigned his work not as nostalgia, but as craft. Discussions shifted from box office numbers to structure, tone, and emotional intelligence. Younger filmmakers rediscovered his films without the weight of contemporary controversy, encountering them simply as stories that worked. Awards bodies and institutions approached recognition carefully. Tributes were framed around contribution rather than circumstance. The emphasis was placed on collaboration, on how Reiner elevated writers, protected actors, and trusted audiences to meet films where they were. Colleagues reflected on his influence in quieter ways. They spoke about lessons learned on set. About confidence given early in careers. About a director who believed that kindness and authority did not have to be opposites. What emerged was a more textured understanding of Rob Reiner, not frozen at the moment of tragedy, but viewed across decades of work and relationship. The industry did not attempt to simplify him. It allowed complexity to stand. In doing so, it honored something essential, that a life can be interrupted without being erased, and that legacy is strongest when it is allowed to be honest.